Once, by the shimmering banks of a river, a pair of cranes built their nest high in an ancient tree. The spot felt safe, a sanctuary where they could start their family away from lurking dangers. One bright morning, the female crane laid 3 perfect eggs, their delicate shells glowing under the sun. Overwhelmed with joy, the cranes dreamed of the day their chicks would hatch, bringing life to their nest. Every day, they took turns watching over the eggs, ensuring warmth and protection. But what they didn't know was that their happiness was fragile, and a cruel fate awaited them. One morning, hunger called, and the cranes left their nest in search of food. The river, rich with fish, provided a quick meal. Satisfied, they eagerly returned, wings beating fast, their hearts filled with excitement. But as they neared their tree, a dreadful silence wrapped around them. The nest was empty, their eggs gone. A frantic search followed, eyes scanning the ground, wings rustling through the branches. There was no trace of them, no broken shells, no clues, just a hollow absence that echoed through the trees. Their joy had turned to despair in an instant. Days passed, grief weighing heavy in their hearts, but the cranes refused to give up. They found a new spot, a different tree, and built another nest, determined to protect their future. Time moved forward, and the female crane laid more eggs, her hope rekindled. This time they devised a plan. The male would go in search of food, while the female remained behind, guarding their precious eggs. Each day followed the same routine, and for a while it seemed to work. But then, one morning, the male crane returned to a heartbreaking sight, his mate trembling, her eyes filled with tears. The eggs were gone. Again. This time there was no mystery. The female had seen it happen, powerless to stop it. A snake, dark and slithering, had crept into their nest. When she tried to defend her young, it hissed, striking out at her with fangs glistening in the sun. Helpless, she had been forced to watch as the creature devoured each egg, swallowing them whole. The male crane's sorrow turned into fury. His wings trembled with rage, but against such a cunning predator, they were helpless. They needed a solution, or else their dream of a family would be lost forever. Desperate, the male crane flew to seek counsel from an old and wise friend, the crab. Perched on a rock near the river, the crab listened to the crane's sorrowful tale. "The snake has stolen our eggs twice. We cannot let it happen again," the crane pleaded, his voice tight with frustration. The crab, known for his cunning mind, remained quiet, thinking deeply. Finally, his eyes gleamed with an idea. "There is a way," he whispered, his voice low, "but it is risky." The crane leaned in, desperate for any hope. "Tell me, I'll do whatever it takes." The crab revealed the plan in hushed tones, and for the first time in weeks, the crane felt hope flicker in his heart. He rushed back to his mate, who listened with wide, anxious eyes. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We cannot afford another mistake." The male crane took her wing in his. "We have no choice. If we do nothing, the snake will come again." With reluctant determination, they agreed. This time they would fight back. The female crane laid her eggs once more, and as night fell, they prepared for what could be their final battle. At dawn, the male crane set the plan into motion. He flew to the riverbank, catching small fish, their scales glistening in the sunlight. One by one, he dropped them, forming a trail leading straight from the burrow of a nearby mongoose to their tree. The scent of fresh fish filled the air, luring the predator closer. Meanwhile, the crane flew over to the snake's den. He let out a loud cry, announcing that their nest once again held eggs, ensuring the snake would hear. It was a gamble, a dangerous trick, but if it worked, they would finally be free. The hours passed like eternity, then rustling in the undergrowth. The mongoose, sniffing hungrily, followed the trail of fish, its sharp eyes locked onto the final prize, the tree. But just as it neared, the snake slithered out, its forked tongue flicking, sensing the presence of eggs. It reared back, its body coiling with anticipation. In that moment, the mongoose and the snake locked eyes, 2 predators drawn to the same prize. For a moment, all was still. Then, with a terrifying hiss, the snake struck. The mongoose leaped, teeth bared, and the battle began, a ferocious fight of nature's deadliest foes. From their nest, the cranes watched, holding their breath. The mongoose lunged, swift and aggressive, its sharp claws tearing at the snake's scales. The snake coiled tightly around its attacker, squeezing with deadly force. The The battle raged, hisses and snarls piercing the air, the grass rustling with the violent struggle. For agonizing minutes, it seemed like neither would back down. Then, with a final snap of its powerful jaws, the mongoose clamped down on the snake's head. A muffled crunch, then stillness. The snake was dead. The cranes gasped in relief. At last, their tormentor had been defeated. But relief was short-lived. The next morning, as the cranes returned from a brief flight over the river, they froze at the sight before them. The mongoose was there, climbing down from their tree. Panic surged through them, their wings flapping wildly as they rushed to the nest. Their hearts pounded. Had their eggs survived? But as they landed, their worst fear was realized. The nest was empty. The eggs were gone. The mongoose, the very creature they had summoned to defeat the snake, had become an even worse enemy. They had exchanged one predator for another, and now there was no going back. A cold silence fell between us as we stared at the empty nest. The realization hit like a crushing weight. We had invited destruction into our home. The very creature we had used as our weapon had turned against us. My mate let out a mournful cry, her wings trembling. I felt her pain as if it were my own. We had been so desperate to stop the snake that we had not considered the true cost of our actions. Now everything was lost. Our eggs, our dreams, they were gone. But the worst part? We had no one to blame but ourselves. I watched as the mongoose disappeared into the thick underbrush, its belly full, its hunger satisfied. It didn't care about our loss. It had only followed its instincts. I wanted to scream, to fight, to tear through the forest and make it pay for what it had done. But what good would that do? The damage was already done. My mate buried her head beneath her wing, her sorrow wrapping around her like a shroud. I knew I had to be strong, but I, too, felt the heavy grip of despair sinking its claws into me. Night fell, and the river shimmered under the moonlight, mocking our grief with its peaceful flow. I replayed everything in my mind, every choice, every mistake. Was there another way? Had we been blind in our desperation? The old crab had warned me that it was risky, but I had been too eager for a solution to listen. Now, the weight of our choices crushed me. I looked at my mate, her breathing slow and heavy with exhaustion. She had suffered too much, and I had failed her. But even as the night stretched on, I refused to let this be the end. By morning, a bitter resolve had settled in my chest. If we were ever to have a future, we had to be smarter, stronger. The mongoose was a new threat, but unlike the snake, it wasn't hiding. It would return sooner or later, driven by the memory of an easy meal. And when it did, we had to be ready. "We will not lose again," I told my mate. My voice was firm, but inside doubt gnawed at me. I had promised to protect her before, and still we had suffered. But this time, I wouldn't make the same mistake. We left our ruined nest behind, flying farther than we ever had before. We searched for the tallest tree, one with thick branches and leaves dense enough to hide us from watchful eyes. It took hours, but finally we found it. An ancient tree, standing alone at the river's edge, its limbs stretching toward the sky. This would be our new home, a fortress. My mate hesitated, her heart still heavy with past losses, but I nudged her gently. "This time will be different," I whispered. I had to believe it, because if we failed again, there would be nothing left. Days passed, and my mate laid her eggs once more. The sight of them filled me with fear and hope in equal measure. We kept watch at all hours, never leaving them unguarded. The river still called to us, but hunger was a lesser enemy now. We took turns hunting, making sure the nest was never alone. At night, we listened, our feathers ruffled with tension at every sound. The world was filled with dangers, but we had learned from our past. We had survived 2 tragedies. This time, we would not let fear or foolishness be our downfall. One evening, as I returned from the river, I heard a rustling in the distance. My heart pounded. My mate was at the nest, alone. I flew faster, my wings slicing through the air, fear clawing at me. Then I saw it, a shadow moving below the tree. The mongoose. It had found us. My mind raced. We couldn't fight it directly. We were no match for its claws and teeth. But we had one advantage. It didn't know we were watching. I landed silently in the branches above, my breath steady. This time we would not be caught off guard. The mongoose sniffed the air, searching for a way up the tree. It circled, frustrated, its claws scraping against the bark. I watched, waiting. My mate stayed still, her eyes locked on mine, trusting me to act. Then an idea struck. I spread my wings and let out a sharp, piercing call, a warning cry that echoed through the trees. Other birds stirred in alarm, their wings flapping wildly as they took flight. The mongoose hesitated. It knew that too much noise would attract unwanted attention. It growled, stepping back, its hunger battling with its instinct for survival. The mongoose lingered, but we did not move. We held our ground. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it turned and slunk back into the underbrush. My mate let out a breath, her body relaxing for the first time in days. We had won. Not through tricks, not through force, but through patience and strategy. As we looked down at our precious eggs, still safe in the nest, I knew we had finally learned the lesson that had cost us so much. Survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about understanding the dangers around us and knowing when to act. Days later, the eggs began to crack. Tiny beaks pushed through fragile shells, soft chirps filling the air. My mate and I watched in wonder as our chicks emerged, weak but alive, taking their first breaths in the world. We had done it. Against the odds, despite the losses, we had protected our family. And as I looked at them, nestled safely in the home we had fought so hard for, I knew one thing for certain: we would never stop fighting for them. Because now, more than ever, we understood what it truly meant to survive.